This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Conservative and progressive are terms that get thrown around in Washington just about every day. And Jim DeMint, more than most, is identified with the conservative label. But in a new book, co-authored with Rachel Bovard, entitled Conservative, Knowing What to Keep, the former Republican senator from South Carolina and former head of the Heritage Foundation, now chairman of the Conservative Partnership Institute, tries to make sure we have firmly in mind exactly what we mean by conservative and progressive. We welcome now Senator DeMint to Bloomberg for today's conversation in chief. He's coming to us from Greenville, South Carolina. So welcome, Senator. It's great to have you with us. Give us what
David, thank you.
Give us what you think of it at the core of what conservative really means or should mean.
Well, conservative is about being grateful for the people who came before us, who left us the things that make our lives meaningful. So conservative is really just knowing what works, what makes life better, and knowing how to keep it. And politics has very little to do with it. We've got the Republicans and Democrats who've become very divisive, and a lot of their rhetoric divides the country. But most of my life was outside of politics, and I know there are a lot of things that unite people, even though we're very different.
So, and one of the points you make in the book is that really the identity of a society has more to do with things like values and traditions than it does with politics, but increasingly we tend to identify a society with its politics.
It's true. I mean, if you turn on the television, it's all politics, particularly if you're watching cable news, very divisive, but very little is covered about what's really pulling America together. I travel a lot. People get along just fine. They're very different, but as long as they can make their own choices about the things that they value, live their lives the way they want to, then they can get along with people who live very differently and believe very differently. And so people are surprised to hear that one of the tenets of conservatism is celebrating and protecting our differences.
So let's talk about some specifics here and how you would apply the conservative versus the progressive label of things. And I want to specifically look at civil rights, because you talk, actually, you quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in your book. But let's talk about Brown against Board of Education, because we tend to think of conservatism as being, let's not change too much. Let's stick with traditions. Well, certainly the segregation between black and white in the public schools was a firm tradition, and it did create some division. Do you think it was rightly decided? Would Brown against Board of Education be decided the same way today?
Well, we should not have segregation based on race. It was an injustice. It was a contradiction to our Constitution and the original values in this country. And one of the points we make in the book, David, is, yeah, we have not completely fulfilled all of the ideas in the Constitution. Martin Luther King referred to it as a promissory note. And so the tension today is throwing the whole thing out and it was written by a bunch of bigots, or understanding what parts of it have made America the greatest country in the world, and also identifying the things that we're not doing well. And that's the whole idea as we move forward, is let's take those things that work and move them into the future. But if it's not working, if it's not just, if it's not fair, then let's throw it out.
We're talking with former Senator Jim DeMint. He's now written a great book called Conservatism, What to Keep. And I want to talk about tribalism, because there's a lot of division, as you focus on in the book, a division in the country right now. And yet you say we should have really a lot of decentralized government, that we should delegate a lot, there should be a lot of individualism. How can you preserve that decentralization without it turning into a lot of tribes bickering with one another, which it feels some days, at least, like we have in this country right now?
Well, yeah, tribalism, as it's reflected in more the political sphere than civil society. If you look again at people go to school together, they work together, they play sports together, they socialize together, and they tend to throw out the differences and enjoy them. But politics, particularly politicians, use differences to put us into group and play us against one another. That's where a lot of political power comes from. The old against the young, the poor against the rich, the whites, the blacks, and everyone is in politics seems to be suggesting that you need the government to protect you and to referee. And there's certainly some of that goes on in our country, David, but for the most part, if civil society is allowed to work with families and the community groups, churches, and if it's decentralized, you'll see a lot less of this tribalism and much more community. And in the middle of that, a lot of individualism being very different in their own lives.
Senator, I'd love to get your thoughts on leaders in conservatism today. Besides yourself, let's take yourself out of it for a moment. And I want to summarize the 4 principles I took from your book of conservatism. It's submission to God, law, and authority, celebrate diversity, property rights as being critical, and also traditions as a quality control. If you look at those 4 principles, would you say that Donald Trump, our president, is a conservative leader? Because most people, I think, would at least pause before they said those all apply to him.
I don't think Donald Trump came to Washington as an ideological conservative. I doubt if he's read Russell Kirk, which we spend a lot of time in the book bringing forward. A lot of what his policy ideas are based on experience and common sense. And in the book, we point out that a lot of the ideas about things that work, if you give them time, are common sense ideas. So many of his policies have been very common sense based on his years of development experience, which translates a lot to the political sphere. But the conservative leaders I would see today, I mean, it's really hard to find them in the media. So I would have to go back into history. We bring a lot of those into the book. People like Russell Kirk and his book, The Conservative Mind, brought the writings of a lot of people who had looked at the world over many years, many decades, and several generations to point out these principles that you talk about, that we're all better off. Life is more meaningful if we understand these basic things that we can keep. And I think you just mentioned most of them in the first part of the book.
Okay. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you being here. It's a really genuinely thoughtful book that I enjoyed reading. It's Jim DeMint. He is former Republican senator from South Carolina and author of the new book, Conservative, Knowing What to Keep.